The API controller attribute can be applied to a controller class to let controllers behave more in line with how you'd expect an API to behave. We encountered a few of those behaviors already, maybe without even realizing it. So it's time to look into what it does in a bit more detail, or at least the parts that are of interest to us. The first thing we already encountered without knowing it is that the API controller attribute adds a requirement for attribute-based routing. When we looked into routing, we learned that route templates should be applied with attributes when building APIs. The API controller attribute effectively forces us to use them. The second thing we've already noticed is that what is returned in case of an error follows a certain format, the problem details format. We noticed that when we got back a 404 not found in the previous module. Which brings me to the next part. We got back a 400 bad request when what we inputted was invalid. That's a bit odd because we never specified the status code we wanted to get back when input is invalid. Well, it's the API controller attribute that enabled this. We will look into input and validation in more detail in the next module, but it is already interesting to know that the API controller attribute helps in this regard. And lastly, model binding rules are adjusted to better fit APIs. We can pass data through to an API via various means. Via the URI like author and course IDs. Another example is via the request body. That is what we just encountered. We pass through a representation of the author we wanted to see created via the request body when posting. But how does ASP.NET Core know where to get that data from? In other words, how does it know that it should look at the request body instead of, for example, at the URL? Well, we can apply binding source attributes to our action parameters on our controller actions to tell ASP.NET Core where a certain value should come from. Multiple attributes for that exist, as you can see on screen now. For an API, the ones that are most useful are from body, from header, from query, and from route. For example, we could change our getAuthor action by explicitly stating that the author ID is coming from the route. Yet, even though we haven't used a binding source attribute like this when getting an author, our code still worked. Also, we did not have to apply a fromBody attribute on our createAuthor action signature either, yet it worked. So what's going on here? Well, by default, the ASP.NET Core runtime attempts to use the complex object model binder when no attribute has been applied. And that pulls data in from value providers in a defined order. In our case, however, thanks to the API controller attribute, the rules are changed a bit to better fit APIs. And that's why all of this worked out of the box, because when using the API controller attribute, fromBody is inferred for complex type parameters. A good example would thus be the creation of an author. fromForm is inferred for action parameters of type iFormFile and iFormFile collection. It is not inferred for any simple or user-defined types. We won't use this one in our API. fromRoute is inferred for any action parameter name matching a parameter in the route template. When more than one route matches an action parameter, any route value is considered fromRoute. And lastly, fromQuery is inferred for any other action parameters. These rules save us from having to identify binding sources manually by applying attributes to the action parameters. When the default behavior needs to be overridden, binding source attributes can still be applied. So there we go. That is what the API controller attribute helps us with. Pretty cool, right? Time for the next demo. Our codebase contains code to create an author and to create a course. But what about creating an author together with a course in one go? Let's check that out.